have had a course taken that he gave in Rome, in a Rome third-year program on Renaissance and post-Renaissance architecture. How many of you were his students in Rome in this room? A healthy number. So I hope he does not feel particularly self-conscious by my taking the liberty of reading through his vitae, because I would like particularly the students to know what an extraordinary person Professor Connors is in the world of art history, and how important he continues to be at this point. What a privilege it has been for you to have him as a teacher. Joe studied at Boston College and at Cambridge University, followed by art history at Harvard, where he got a PhD in 1978. He has taught at the University of Chicago, 78 to 80, at Columbia from 80 to 2001. And he has held fellowships from very many distinguished institutions, including the NEH, the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Gallery of Art, the Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome, All Souls College, Oxford, and the Clark Institute. He was Slade Professor at Oxford in 1999. He was elected to the Accademia Nazionale di San Luca in Rome in 1993, and to the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia in 2006. From 1988 to 92, he was director of the American Academy in Rome, and from 2002 to 2010, director of Villa Itati, the Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in Florence. He has served on the advisory board of the Centro Palladio in Vicenza since 1993, and he was president of the Renaissance Society of America in 2014 to 16. And since 2021, he's been teaching at the Rome program for Notre Dame University. He has published books on Baroque architecture, Roman urban planning, architecture in prints, Piranesi and Frank Lloyd Wright, and he's in the process of completing the long-term project of a comprehensive monograph on Francesco Borromini, which he is going to be talking about today, continuing themes of architecture and society that inform all of his writings. It is with great pride and with great pleasure that I present you our very own Professor Joseph Connors.
Thank you very much, Stefanos, both for the kind introduction and for the invitation to come. We can just, yeah, okay. It's not my first time in South Bend. I've come several times before, first in the days of my good friend Thomas Gordon Smith, whom I knew from our Rome days, and then Dean Lykoudis under his deanship, and both have been wonderful visits. I first went to Rome in 1972 and lived on the Celio, about 400 or 500 yards from what is now the Notre Dame Center. When I was there, I read for the first time Goethe's Italian Journey and was extremely moved by this wonderful piece of literature, especially by his emphasis that when you go to Rome, you are reborn. And I felt at that time, as a youngish grad student, that I was being reborn on the Celio. In any case, I'm extremely grateful to the Rome program for the chance to go back to Rome for these past 3 years. It's been to see Rome again in the context of wonderfully supportive colleagues, of students who wear out their shoes, who know how to walk, and who are talented and tireless sketchers. When you're sitting in a church and the students behind you say, "Pass me some water," it's not for a drink, it's for the watercolors. In any case, it's been absolutely fantastic, and I'd love to thank Notre Dame for allowing me these 3 years of still a second rebirth. Francesco Borromini's life began and ended at the water's edge. Get this, right? Not doing its thing. Okay, so.
I need to change one additional thing.
Okay, no?
I think we'll be okay.
I'll say again, he was born at the water's edge in 1599 in the hamlet of Bissone that you see in the middle of the Lake of Lugano there, not so far from Lugano itself, in what is now Canton Ticino in Switzerland. He died, that's the little town, he died by his own hand in 1667 on the house on the bank of the Tiber near San Giovanni dei Fiorentini. Apart from a teenage apprenticeship in Milan, his entire career was spent in Rome. Here he would develop into one of the most imaginative designers in the history of Italian architecture, second only, or with, let's say, Michelangelo and Palladio as his peers. Though Borromini took a second seat to Bernini during his last tumultuous decades, 50 years after his death, publishers heroized him. Architects from Portugal to Bohemia reveled in the curve and perforated walls, daring vaults and magic effects of light. The fall from grace in the age of Neo-Palladianism was precipitous, but the recovery in the 20th century complete, or at least I hope the book I am trying to write will make it so. Now, in most places, I would come and give a lecture of Borromini's early work is this, and then in 30 minutes, his middle work is this, and then at the end, I would say his late work is this. Since everybody at Notre Dame knows Rome well, what I will do now is just show about 6 of his key works for a few seconds each, just to remind you or refresh your memories of what I'm sure you've seen, certainly my students have seen, and then I'll get on to the subject. It's slightly misnamed. It shouldn't be called Borromini, an introduction. It's Borromini, my introduction. It's the introduction to this book that I'm finishing right now. It's what the reader will see when he opens the book. Of course, the first one begun, I put his age, by the way, it's more interesting than the date. In his mid-30s, the famous cortile of San Carlino, in this amazing church. Just, you know it all, so we'll see that there. Then the first work that was really visible to the public, because San Carlino didn't have a facade at first, the oratory of the Filippini, next to the church of Santa Maria in Vallicella, seen here in this beautiful, raking spring light. You can tell something's wrong with this building on the left. If a church like the one on the right has one window, hey, wait a minute, the building on the left has 20 windows. It must be something different going on behind it. And of course it is. The most famous building is the Church of Sant'Ivo, not really a church, a university chapel, begun at in his 42nd year. It went on for almost 2 decades. It's the most interpreted or perhaps over-interpreted building in the history of architecture, and it is one of the most stimulating and amazing. Many of you know it, and many of you have been in for Sunday Mass or whatever, famous for its spiral. Borromini did, well, not exactly did, but was involved in 6 libraries. This is more than any other architect in Rome. Only Baldassare Longhena in Venice did as many libraries. Bernini did one and thought about another one at some point, but there's no comparison. He's a man with a tremendous collection of books. For the day, 900 books was an enormous personal library, and it's very fitting that he's the architect that's chosen to do the most libraries. This is just 2, an early one in the Vallicella and a late one at the Sapienza, Sant'Ivo. He also worked on 2 buildings for religious women. One is a convent for singing nuns, Santa Lucia in Celci, where the outside is so grim and boring that I don't even want to show it to you. That's what convent life could be like. This one is more representative. It's not for a convent of women, it's for a group of noble women who wanted to live together under the aegis of a very powerful and interesting noble woman herself, a Farnese, unfinished, in Trastevere, now a luxury hotel. There are 3 export products, altars made in Rome and sent somewhere else, or at least the drawings made in Rome. There's one in Siena, which I discovered. There was one meant for Lisbon, which was partly sent and then lost. But the most beautiful of Borromini's work, I think, is this fantastic marble altar in a church you never go to in Naples. Even the Neapolitan aficionados don't usually get here, the Church of Santi Apostoli in Naples. But I show it as, I think, just an amazingly beautiful thing, done at the same time as the oratory, about age 40. In midlife, he reconstructed, restored the Lateran Basilica, the Cathedral of Rome, the seat of the Bishop of Rome, not St. Peter's, but the Lateran, a Constantinian wreck in a way that was falling down and much retouched, and he finally restored it or refashioned it in ways that are controversial, but at the same time giving us, especially in the aisles that you see on the right, some of the most beautiful works of 17th century architecture. He did 6 palaces, or what happens in this period usually is pieces of palaces, wings of palaces. The Palazzo Spada was done before his time, but he had a hand in adding what was probably the cheapest, but has become the most symbolic work of his career, the little perspective colonnade, the prospettiva, added as a garden folly in a way. I'll get back to that in the lecture. The Propaganda Fide is a work he worked on for most of middle age and his later decades, but the stuff we see, the fantastic chapel with the rib vault and that amazing curve near McDonald's, as you can see, but near Piazza di Spagna, is one of the great works, but because it's part of the Vatican city-state, it's very seldom entered. The chapel sometimes a bit, with permission, the inside never, and yet it's a fascinating building that I've explored a lot. The last work, the first work was San Carlino, but the last work is the facade of San Carlino, done in the last 2 years of his life. And I'll talk more about this, but it's an amazing essay in the curve. Okay, that's my survey of his career. Now on to the lecture. The forthcoming book, I call it The Architect in Society, takes on 3 difficult tasks. 1, visual appreciation of complex architecture. 2, a study of the shifting social fabric of Baroque Rome. 3, a biography of a hyperactive man who imparted his inner life to almost no one. The following reflections on method set forth the ways in which I try to go about each of these tasks. Architecture, close looking. Each chapter in the book begins with an exercise in close looking, and there I want to focus on works that are strangely beautiful while remaining open to the unexpected, the jarring, and the confrontational. Borromini's facades ask to be seen by the spectator in motion. The interiors invite exploration, even nosiness, in penetrating beyond the usual routes to hidden pockets of space, rewards for the truly curious. Borromini counted on movement to convey meaning, and often programmed an eter that could be imagined by all, even if traversed only by a few. A master psychologist, he found ways to challenge the visitor's perception of the shape of buildings and the ways they interact with urban space. Sensitive to sound, as that's an amazing small urban plan, for instance. Sensitive to sound as well as sight, he expected the visitor to delight in music coming from hidden balconies and to savor the spoken word whispered along curving walls. How were these buildings projected? Borromini defies us to find out. Quote, "I would never have entered this profession only to become a copyist," is one memorable outburst. He refused the commonplace, not only in architecture, but in drawing. His first mentor, Carlo Maderno, 1620s here, his 20s, treasured the flawless pen and wash drawings that the young man produced for him, that was his first job, in the busy shop in the last years of the old Titan's life. But when Borromini came into his own after Maderno's death in 1629, he's in the middle of doing Palazzo Barberini then, he renounced the allure of color to explore the creative possibilities of the graphite pencil, a relatively new material then confined to the manual trades. You know, picture the carpenter with the pencil behind his ear and so forth, not for high-class drawings. But it was a pencil plan of the Casa dei Filippini that won him his first commission, and a few small pencil drawings that convinced Pope Innocent X to have him restore the Cathedral of Rome, St. John, Lateran. Patrons admired the hair-fine, and I love this word, esattezza, the exactness of these drawings, and the ways they made problems seem both solved and still open. Some have an X-ray quality, as though one could see through masonry. Pencil allowed the architect to treat space like sculpture, making it more fluid without losing its core geometry. It facilitated the many-layered plans, sometimes as complex as 6 or 7 layers deep. To study these enigmas now, The scholar engages in a close looking that one might call graphite archaeology, attempting to see through upper layers until primal ideas swim into focus. Borromini owned a dozen compasses, and their intensive use brought drama to the drawings. In the popular imagination, his most characteristic creation is the curved facade. A French writer says he's enemy of flat faces, ennemi des faces plates, adding that there's no straight lines in any of his work, which is, of course, an exaggeration. For the oratorians at Tantamari and Vallicella, he created a curved facade, or rather a curved central section in a wider facade. It is a brilliant exercise in high relief, whereas the usual accoutrements of a Counter-Reformation facade, pilasters, cornice, volutes that span the transition from a wider lower to a narrower upper story, they're all there, but they're applied to a wing with 20 windows. They're like painting on the wall, sculpting in high relief on the wall, rather than building from nothing, so to speak. The curving parts were done in Roman brick with near invisible joins. They made the architect think of a single piece of terracotta fired in a colossal oven. That's his metaphor. The facade offered an organ tone of welcome to a medium-sized oratory. Only the small lower part of the building is the oratory itself, that takes up only these few bays. Borromini compared the facade to a welcoming embrace. It differs to the massive travertine facade of the church next to it in material and size, but outcompetes it in audacity. Borromini's facades do not just occupy urban space, they interact with it. The curve of the oratory facade is generated in the early drawings by a long radius, one that would fit within the limits of the vast piazza then being planned. When Borromini redrew the facade years later, the piazza had not been done and it was not feasible anymore. The piazza was going to be narrower, so therefore the radius becomes shorter. Shorter means deeper curve for the same width. Shorter the radius, the more dramatic the curve. We see this in the drawings where the facade is built, but the drawings of it, as we'll see a bit later, show it deepening in curve. The congregation of the Propaganda Fide had a long facade with a deep central curve, which was an invitation to stop and enter. The radius of the curve on the plans is set at exactly the width of the narrow street on which it stands. The shorter the radius, as I said, the deeper the curve. And you can see that here. And of course, the radius of the cornice will be shorter still, and therefore the cornice deeper still. That's a formula for real drama. Borromini's facades with this drama seem to sculpt the sky. Many buildings of the period, and one thinks especially of Bernini's palaces, which make beautiful pictures by printmakers, but none conveys anything like this degree of corporeal engagement with the passing spectator. No curves are more dramatic than those of San Carlo, alle, Quattro Fontane. This is a church that he came back to. He wanted to be buried in this church, actually. Well, it didn't happen. But it's his last work. About the facade, a French savant of the next century, the Baron de Montesquieu, a philosopher, touring Rome in 1728, observed that since the church was small, Borromini combined concave and convex to give the eye a longer distance to Rome. Sometimes people out of the field come up with just the right observations. The philosopher was on to something important. Try as the architect might, the street frontage of the church proper could not be expanded. It was blocked by the canted corner on the left, which, as you can see, had one of the Quattro Fontane, a big reclining guy, who could never keep company, nude, half nude and bearded, with the saints on the facade. It was obviously that could never. He tried at one point, he does a sketch saying, well, maybe I could take in the corner, make the facade wider, but it could never be done. And so given that very limited width, the facade instead became an essay in controlled undulation, curvaceous but tightly governed by geometry. Triangles were used on the interior to create a firm armature for these very movemented walls, but for the facade, the triangles moved out into the street to offer anchorage for the architect's compass, the tool that lets the spectator believe that he might possess a stone sculpting eye. The architect in society, the second difficult task I'm trying to do. An architect with as wide a spectrum of commissions as Borromini offers many avenues into the society of Baroque Rome. One goes to these buildings because of their fascinating designs, but once the outer layers of a commission are peeled off, they reveal something deeper, deeper social and intellectual concerns. In his nearly 5 decades in the city, Borromini was involved not only with the famous churches just mentioned, but with 8 palaces and 6 major libraries. Although there are no women in his life, of course, just mentioned this, there are these 2 residences, or one a convent and the other a residence for pious women, and so on. They give me a chance to get into all of these movements, what I call the virginity explosion of Baroque Rome, where convents become a dominant force in shaping the landscape. Let me get into that. In the Sapienza, if you're doing university, it gets you the chance to study the transformation of university education in these crucial decades. The architect's own house and collection, as we'll see, lead us into the wider world of virtuoso collecting and natural science. And his work for a series of ambassadors of the United Iberian Monarchy and his apparent allegiance to the Spanish side of the French-Spanish divide allow us to see a fundamental tension in international politics worked out in architecture. Basic questions about the artist and society also arise. Principally, how did an immigrant stonecutter rise and eventually become the knighted architect of one of the most important buildings in papal Rome? What kind of pressure did the profession impose on the personality? Lastly, a fundamental question always in the back of one's mind, how were these buildings paid for? And I have chapters on this sort of thing. Palace culture. Palaces have been the most intensely studied of all fields of 17th century architecture in the past generation. The primary sources include an array of handbooks for the principal officers of a cardinal's household, the maestro di casa and the maestro di camera. These grave officials, they're not priests usually, but they're very grave, presided over the rituals of visiting, of vesting, of praying, of entertaining, of grieving, and burying. Many aristocratic households followed a 2-brother strategy. The capostipite, the patriarch, married and produced children to pass on the primogeniture, while a second brother entered the church to gain access to the lucrative offices and sinecures reserved for the clergy. The cardinalate implied taking minor orders, but not necessarily ordination, so that in case of tragedy, the clerical brother could retreat, send back the red hat, the wonderful word scapularsi, send back the hat, marry, and continue the line. For instance, this is one of these handbooks, by the way, of showing you how one moved through these buildings. For instance, how one negotiated these long enfilades by giving gentlemen exactly the number of rooms. One even says, like the bricks on a tennis floor that a gentleman would require, and then no more. And so the highly calibrated courtesy of the sort that would make anyone nervous, I think, but this is the ritual of the day. The Carpegna family from Urbino put their stock in a team of 3 brothers. The first was a humble but well-connected priest. The second, a dashing count who tried to build a palace near Trevi. The last, a cardinal who did build that palace and remained close to Borromini and his young nephew all their lives. Wealth and honors came from the church, but the lay brother was expected to produce proles, offspring, the one thing that could give the family immortality. Borrowing an idea from Rubens, who in turn borrowed it from a Roman coin, Borromini introduced the infant cornucopia into the imagery of the palace. This is proles, along with crowns and tiaras and mitres and gold coins and chains of honor and everything. Proles is the thing that makes all of those others worthwhile. Borromini's long-term patron, Orazio Falconieri, the head of a Florentine banking family in Rome, was especially conscious of the way architecture could bolster the longevity of his line. He employed Borromini to extend an older Renaissance palace on Via Giulia, just behind the Farnese. If Cardinal Spada was another one I treat mad for perspective, Orazio Falconieri was mad for heraldry. Heraldry come alive, especially in the form of noble birds, is a recurrent theme in Borromini's architecture. The previous heraldry of this family was a falcon's ladder. If you're a falconer, you have a perch in a way. And Borromini changed it to the bird itself, swooping, alighting, or standing as a sentinel. The coin-joined arms of husband and wife were displayed in the apartment where children were to be conceived. And this is the fun of figuring out who was where, who lived where in these apartments. You get a good plan and you figure out the movements and where the bedrooms are. And for instance, here we have the conjoined arms of the Falconieri family on the left, the ladder, and the Sacchetti, his noble wife, on the right, and this is where new Falconieri Sacchetti, so to speak, were conceived. The extension to the older palace was to serve as the residence of Orazio's brother, the cardinal. And not only the cardinal, but it was meant for future young abbés that every family would hope would grow into cardinals. When Cardinal Lelio died unexpectedly, just as the palace was being finished, Borromini, in his most poetic vein, outfitted the apartment destined for him, not as a place where he could live, but as a cenotaph to his memory, with cryptic ceilings that convey the message of the cardinal's untiring labors for justice. It's not a place to live in, but a place to live on in, so to speak. Orazio adhered to the Tuscan practice of using names to remake an ancestor, or to look into the telescope from the other end, to have descendants far in the future remake himself. The strange Falcon herms that people are so puzzled by on the facade on Via Giulia draw Egyptian-inspired symbolism to remind eventual descendants of the founder's remade name. Intergenerational time was a preoccupation of another family of Borromini's patrons. This is why the palaces get you into such interesting things in society. The Spada will surely meet the youngest brother, Virgilio Spada, but for now I want to dwell on his cardinal older brother. They designed a chapel lined in red marble inlaid by the best Neapolitan marmorari and hung with marble ancestor portraits. You can see them, especially on the right. They look like they're hanging on cords, as though they're portraits in a wall, as though they're hanging on a velvet. This is the way Roman apartments look like, in a way. So it's a kind of camera for the dead, so to speak, of a very noble sort. But it's also a history book. Some of these ancestors, one has to say, rose out of the mist of time and eluded hard documentation. In other words, they were fiction, and there was no reason to exclude them. They give one of the Spada gives the reason. This was, and this is a wonderful word, this was rectified history, as inclusive as possible, since it would serve as the basis for all future histories of the families. You want everyone in. Once again, we're dealing with the patron as architect. Borromini did what he could with a beautiful floral design for the pavement. You can just see it on the bottom, but it was mainly a cameo appearance. If intergenerational time was a theme of the Spada chapel, solar time was a theme of Cardinal Spada's palace. As a devotee of the latest French developments in optics and catoptrics, which is the science of mirrors, and also anamorphosis, the science of distorted perspective, that was developed by French mathematicians in the convent of the Trinita ai Monti at the top of the Spanish Steps in Rome, and the cardinal was extremely close to this order. The most learned of these monks was called Père Mignon, devised an astronomical gallery for the cardinal, and also for his own convent, but especially for the cardinal. You see it on the right, where a spot of reflected sunlight gives the hour and some astronomical information as well. It was a living, hourly demonstration of that paradoxical concept, perspectiva horaria, perspective that tells the time. Borromini entered Bernardino Spada's service when most of the work of adapting an older Renaissance palace was done. He found himself serving a cardinal who was a devotee of perspective, as this in this anamorphosis there. His first task was to rethink the cardinal's garden, in particular the wall where a decade earlier, the cardinal had commissioned a large painting of a colonnade in perspective, but just a painting. That you would call it a prospettiva finta, a fictive perspective. And then the cardinal got tired of the prospettiva ficta. He told his neighbor, I want your garden. Okay, that happened. And so he punched through the wall, replacing the painting with a colonnade in diminishing perspective. Here's a wonderful plan by the Swedish architect Nicodemus Tessin in Stockholm. In diminishing perspective, that protruded 8 meters into the neighbor's garden. In the terminology of the period, he replaced a prospettiva finta with a prospettiva reale, a real perspective. Though more the cardinal's idea than Borromini's, it introduces us to a concept that pervades the culture in which Borromini's patrons moved, ingano, artful deception. It was considered a source of delight, even a form of education, to solve optical puzzles and resolve anamorphic images. And here's a Shakespeare quote from Richard II, because this culture is widespread. Richard II says, like those perspectives which, when rightly gazed upon, show nothing but confusion, but eyed awry from the side, distinguish form. So it's the Shakespeare world just as much as it is here. Borromini shared this culture. Thus, it would not be surprising when he comments on the oratory facade that the Filippini made a brilliant thing because he decided to deceive the eye of the passerby, all in the spirit of delighting and educating patron and public alike with an artful falsehood. There's a danger of supposing that Baroque Rome was an entirely static society. Some groups within it were on the rise, while some were entering into decline. This applies not only to the constant efforts of gentlemen to rise into the nobility and provincials to metamorphose into cittadini romani, but also the religious orders and the congregations that were coming into being or attempting to purge themselves through radical reform. They're all on the move, in a way. Society is very flexible. There is nothing like architecture to make, these are things I don't have to tell Notre Dame, there is nothing like architecture to make a corporate body pose the question, who are we? Or what, after the changes of the past generation, have we become? An assertion about one's place in society seems to hang on every design decision. The group that provided the young Borromini with his most expensive and expansive early commission, the Vallicella, the fellows of Philip Neri at Santa Maria and Vallicella, were willing to bulldoze a whole neighborhood for their new residents, but remained surprisingly insecure about the image they wanted. Followers of a charismatic and humorous saint, skillful preachers, crack church historians, devotees of the cult of early Christianity, sage confessors, precise liturgists, patrons of avant-garde altarpieces, sponsors of emotionally moving music, they nevertheless tended in their conversations with architects to insist not on what they were, but on what they were not. They were not monks and fanatics of mortification or protégés of a great cardinal or Jesuits professing military governance. There were none of these, they kept insisting. As priests, they were committed to a celibate life, but they took no vows. They could amass wealth, and many did. They were a community that insisted in living together like a Florentine republic, in a way. There was a floor of dignity beneath which they didn't want to drop, and a ceiling of ostentation higher than which they did not want to go, but where in between they wanted to be, they did not know. Now, an architect came, that's not uncommon, I guess. An architect called Paolo Marascelli came along, this is a decade before Borromini, and he found, this is the building, of course, and the wonderful Levenkroel view, and he gave them a solution. And this is fantastic, because you can read social history through the quotations that this earlier architect chose for this. He chose three models. He said, you'll be happy if you can have quotations or allusions to these three buildings. One was the majestic early, late 16th century Canonica of Milan Cathedral by Pellegrino Tibaldi. The second was a new palace in Rome, not for the Borghese family, but for the retinue of the Borghese. They thought, oh, that's just right for us. And the third was going to be a Palladian convent, the convent of the Carità in Venice now, at the Accademia Museum in Venice. So, they felt very happy. These three things were just right for their middle level of society. But in the end, Borromini comes along, changes all of that, and he's marvelous because it's not that he, as the architect, if the patron could become the architect could become the patron. And the thing is that he gave the congregation a building that proclaimed not what they had been or what they were, but what they would want to be in future generations. The decades around 1600 saw the transformation of the Quirinal Hill and the surrounding area with the appearance of a dozen small churches and convents. The full title of Borromini's church, that you all know, is San Carlo, San Carlino, of course, but let's give it the full title. San Carlo, La Chiesa della Santissima Trinità, they're Trinitarians, and San Carlo Borromeo, who has nothing to do with the Trinitarians, but they liked him, of the Trinitarians, Scalzi, the discalced or unshod Trinitarians, of the ransom of Spain. No, they're not ransoming Spain. They're the Trinitarians of Spain, because every nation has a branch, who are the unshod Trinitarians of Spain, whose business is ransom. Ransom is a key word, one that leads us to the social history of the explosion of piracy and the religious orders devoted to bringing Christian captives back from the prisons of Algiers. Discalced is a clue, and here this is marvelous here. In one of the pendentas of the church, if you look really closely, they're showing a ransom. It can be dated almost, I think, to 1610, a ransom from Algiers. And you see the money on the table. It's amazing how brave these monks were to bring lots of gold. And, what if they were just killed and the gold taken? Well, there'll be no more ransom. So that's the thing that keeps this going. But it's extremely dangerous, and they can buy back people. If a person is not bought back at the right time, they're shipped to Constantinople, which is the big slave market, and that's the end of them. And Cervantes, who was taken prisoner off the coast of France after the Battle of Lepanto, was there for 5 years, tried to escape and never did. And if you go back to Don Quixote, get your high school text of Don Quixote out and read the part called The Captive's Tale, and he tells what it's like to be a prisoner in Algiers until a Trinitarian monk comes and rescues him, ransoms him, and lets him get back and write Don Quixote and lots of other stuff. So it's a very important part of Spanish cultural life, these redemptions. And that's what this order is all about. In fact, Cervantes is buried in a Trinitarian church, Trinitarian nuns' church in Madrid. Sant'Ivo alla Sapienza, and this is the map I've made up, of all of these scalzi or discalced religious groups, and they have such confusing instructions for their architects. The Trinitarians, that's where the Trinitarians of San Carlo, they took their simple fare, bread and water practically, in a refectory where they could read under the crucifix, and I discovered this by climbing up and looking down at the original crucifix base. They took their simple fare at a refectory where they could read under the crucifix, "They gave me gall to drink," from the Gospels. While their prior, returning through the Barberini gardens that were next door, from sessions with Cardinal Barberini, could speak of his disegno to build a church richer than Solomon's temple. A self-contradictory program tends to baffle architects, but Borromini worked it to his advantage. The prior and eventually the monks at San Carlo came to believe that an imaginative design built on a shoestring could express the full range of their evolving corporate character. Sant'Ivo alla Sapienza is the most interpreted monument of the Baroque. I like to liken it to a Christmas tree. You have one interpretation, put it like an ornament. You have another interpretation, put it as an ornament. And for all our Christmas trees, the more ornaments, the better. So a new interpretation comes, great, it can Dix all put it up. But when you get into the stuff and you're reading the 25th interpretation, you want to say, well, all of this is the reception of the church, people thinking this up over time. It's a lighthouse, it's a fire of whatever. But anyway, is there no room for intention? What did the architect and his circle of patrons, because there's never just one, really want? And then it gets interpreted and so forth. With a corporate patron like a university, intention can be a slippery concept. I must say nobody does this. People just add more very personalized and sometimes erudite and always obscure interpretations, not really caring whether they contradict anything else. But for me, although intention is a slippery concept, especially when a pope is looking over the institution's shoulder, nonetheless, Sant'Ivo presents an unusually complex case since it was built under 3 popes. A perceptive architect, however, should be able to divine a range of intentions in his patrons and find an imagery to express them. Borromini was astute enough to see how the fretful advocates of the consistory, the name of the lawyers' school that really dominated things here, he was able to see their nervousness about the competition from the Jesuits, who were much more efficient and free, to award the highest degree, the doctorate, or as we still call it, the laurea. He could sense the excitement aroused by efforts sponsored by the Barberini to explore Hadrian's Villa with its many curved buildings. He called them Tempietti. He admired the intellectual prowess of 2 disciples of Galileo who succeeded to the chair of mathematics, one after the other. just as the design was taking shape, and they're part of the public, or part of the patron, you might say, the corporate patron. He could sympathize with Alexander VII, the next pope's fussy desire to make the church more regal, that's to say more decorative, but also with Alexander's ambition to bring the university into the Republic of Letters by adding a great library. One could try to weave all of this into a patterned tapestry of intention. I like that, patterned tapestry of intention. Furthermore, if learned emblems and Kabbalistic symbols are set aside for a moment, there may be something to be learned by focusing on the way architects think, both in terms of allusion to earlier architecture and in terms of function and movement, that is, of education as a journey from entrance to goal. And I think not just symbol from books, but where do you move in this building? That was the second, social history. The third difficult task is biography. A life that's interesting with his journey from the Swiss lakes to the summit of the architectural profession in the papal capital deserves a full bibliography, as well as an account of the buildings, a biography rather. The biographer runs up against a wall of silence. There are hundreds of documents relating to construction, but little of this is personal. There are no diaries or private letters. Borromini's one publication, the so-called Opus Architectonicum, a later Latin name for his book, was written mostly by his patron and appeared 50 years after his death. By way of contrast, we know far more about Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the leading artist of the age. Bernini was a witty conversationalist. In his 6 months in Paris, people said he's un fort beau diseur, a diseur. He can just talk your head off, you know. Every word was taken down by a very dutiful secretary called Chanteloup, who it was published in the 19th century. Bernini was the founder of a house museum. The house is still there, but not the museum, unfortunately, and was the focus of a biography factory organized by his family at his death and written by one of his sons. Borromini had no biography factory. The guardian of his memory was his nephew and heir, Bernardo Castelli Borromini, a double name, a teenager called down from the Lake Country to keep the aging master company. So you have a master who's in his 60s, and this 18-year-old comes down as a nephew, not a son, but a nephew, to sort of continue the firm and learn from the uncle. But he turns out to be hopeless and incompetent. He was not the ideal heir, either as architect or as someone to conserve the memory. Everyone says, what about the rivalry, Bernini-Borromini? Well, the shadow that looms over Borromini's life is, of course, Bernini. Part of my chapter on personality is devoted to this relationship. Borromini resented Urban VIII's decision to make Bernini architect of St. Peter's just days after Maderno died in 1629. Borromini thought he should have been. Over the long run, the position would bring Bernini endless opportunities for financial gain, principally in the baldacchino and the colonnade of St. Peter's. It would also bring him to the brink of disgrace, and this is a wonderful way of illuminating the baldacchino in a procession that went right by Santa Maria Maggiore just as I was to leave in June. So these things are still relevant. Anyway, I try in this chapter to shed light on Borromini's personality by comparing the two side by side from many points of view: family, money, houses, collections, books, honors, such as knighthood. Finally, what contemporaries would call complexion, the balance of humors at the core of personality. And this, of course, is the trouble that Bernini runs into with the bell towers of St. Peter's that don't work. And this illustration by a Notre Dame student, I must say, very well done, of how important those foundations were and how badly they worked under Bernini. And this was a cause of great rift between Bernini, who did a bad job, and Borromini, who criticized him very strongly. Complexion. The fact that Borromini took his own life demands an attempt at explanation. The medical categories that have been applied from, in his own time, stralunata, lunacy, to the 18th century, pazzo, pazzia, to the 19th century, schizothymic, that was the fashionable thing. They've never seemed very satisfactory. The direction pointed out by the great scholars Rudolph and his wife Margaret Wittkover was to look at the stresses that fickle patronage brought about in a personality dominated by a strong sense of honor. This, I think, has been more promising. Thus, that Borromini suffered from bouts of, this is what the doctor would call it, hypochondriac melancholy, might be a fruitful lead, especially when we look at the cultural dimensions of melancholy. I mean, of course, it's the most famous book on melancholy ever written by Burton in 1621, the Oxford Dean. Still a readable, unbelievably long and unbelievably interesting book on melancholy, not only as disease, but as fashion. And in some ways, Borromini's constant wearing of black, a Spanish fashion, can be seen to have something in common, say, with Hamlet, as you remember the line, who's always wearing an inky cloak and customary suit of solemn black. There are three other paths to biography. We don't have letters and so forth. And they are indirect. Borromini the man comes into clearer focus when we look at the people closest to him. Thus, his contacts with the clergy and the nobility, there were dozens of people, of course, and the building trades. Three stand out: the oratorian Virgilio Spada, the guidebook writer Fioravante Martinelli, and the Portuguese noble Castel Rodrigo. Here are the three. Virgilio Spada is the second most important person in my book, and there's a mini monograph on him in it, practically. He's the patron rather than the architect. He was the son of a provincial tax farmer who loved architecture, was building mad, so to speak, and so he grew up with a dad that was had money and was designing all sorts of little buildings and big buildings around his provincial town. He decided not to join the Jesuits, but entered the Oratory, a congregation that had no objection to his great wealth, and it's an enormous fortune that he has and that he brings with him. He took an interest in the building program of the Oratorians from the day of his arrival. He took over, really, even though he was in his 20s. Some years later, approaching 40, he became Borromini's main advocate, smoothing the shock of his innovations for a conservative congregation. He was the knowledgeable amateur whom we find boasting after conversations with Borromini. This is a wonderful, pay attention to the first word, we were designing this, we were designing. The pinnacle of his influence came under Innocent X when he guided work at the Lateran Basilica, the new prisons on the Via Giulia, the Sapienza, Piazza Navona, and a little town north of Rome, San Martino. The documentary record shows why Spada was considered the leading administrator of architectural projects at his time. He knew all about contracts, about prices, about materials. He knew the hierarchy of the trades. He knew where patrons were vulnerable to being cheated. He knew something about structure and was not afraid to creep through underground tunnels to check on foundations. You can imagine him in an outfit like this, creeping under St. Peter's. Of course, he would have changed into jeans or something, I imagine. He knew the value of the archives where problems came up and buildings of long gestation were in trouble. He kept good records and archived all the drawings he came to his way, and the arrival in 1896 of two huge volumes at the Vatican Library, which are known among specialists as the Spada Papers, set off a century of research on Baroque architecture. Although a terrible draftsman himself, Spada could at least show craftsmen what he wanted, and he often picked up the pen. Aside from these major commissions, Spada often called Borromini in for a cameo appearance, and sometimes Borromini provoked him with wit. Now, with things like this, you can't take these things seriously. You have to see them as a scherzo, like the Borromini idea for the new prison that Spada is in charge of building, where he fashions it as a kind of mouth of, well, not hell, it's like a Baroque villa where he says, abandon all worry, all you who enter here, as if you're about to enter all worry. The prison got a much more fitting door, but I think we have to interpret these things not as project, but as scherzo, as wit between two people who understood each other. Above all, Spada knew about money. He recognized the essential role of debt in all Roman building, and he knew how to both control debt and to incur it and to get rid of it. And he could give advice to aristocratic families on how to manage their debt. It's an extremely interesting, somewhat long part of the book. Aside from money, Spada had a personal aesthetics. He was drawn irresistibly to innovation. It was not so much an ideal of beauty that he was chasing, but rather a quality he calls the singolare, the striking, the singular, the distinctive. He could make a work worthy if he could make it stand out. He was fond of mosaic, and we know where he lived, that's circled in red, at what's called the Torre dell'Orologio of the Filippini, Piano Nobile apartment. Not a big apartment, but he has his art collection and so forth in there. But he was also fond of mosaic. I like the comparison I like best is Abbot Suger, the famous abbot of Saint Denis, who loved the glistening and the marble-like and all of that, the thing where light is in the marble. He appreciated the mystery of frozen veins in precious marbles. Like his brother, the Cardinal Spada, he was well informed about the latest developments in optics. He was knowledgeable about Galilean astronomy, and he was a magnet for those who wanted Innocent X to reverse the Inquisition's verdict on the Tuscan scientist. He had a respectable collection of 40 scientific instruments, including concave and convex mirrors, an armillary sphere, solar watches and astrolabes, quadrants, celestial spheres, lenses, a microscope, a telescope. He had access from the tower you see over his rooms where under the bell, when Rome didn't have any light pollution, so to speak, where he could carry out observations with his telescope. He had a respectable art collection, and one I like best, it's now in Palazzo Spada. It's this amazing painting called The Philosophers. We really should rename it, well, it has been renamed by the museum as The Astronomers, where the painter Niccolo Tornioli throws all the schools of astronomy together with studied ambiguity. Ptolemy with the feathers on your left, Ptolemy of Egypt. The bearded figure with the ruff is Tycho Brahe. Copernicus in the middle with the fur coat you would need if you were up in Poland staying up all night to look at the universe. On the very far right, mysterious, not really mixing much with the crowd, looking a little bit dangerous is Galileo, of course. And all of these schools are together without him committing himself to any one of them. The second person in Borromini's life is called Fioravante Martinelli. He's known to church historians, but obviously not to the general culture. He made his reputation in church history, but he achieved fame and some money by writing popular guidebooks. And one of them is called Roma Ricercata. It went through many editions. It's a tiny little thing, smaller than paperback, really it's tiny. But especially in the third edition of 1658, we find him dwelling at great length, changing the text a lot, to dwell on Borromini and how good he is and what the theory behind his architecture is. And in it, he included, I think, 3 prints, tiny prints that unfold. You know, this is maybe, when it's unfolded from the guidebook, maybe 4 inches by 3 inches, you know, so the guidebook is smaller. But they're drawings supplied by Borromini, and all the things that are wrong with the buildings and the drawings of Borromini projecting what's wrong because that's the way he wanted you to see the building. So they're incredibly valuable. The relationship between the two men was vibrant on both the intellectual and the personal level. I mean, Martinelli's texts are where we find Borromini never wrote anything down, but where he found out what he thought about his architecture, what he thought about innovation. His unexpected death in 1667, we don't know how, threw Borromini into a tailspin. It was followed by a tumultuous week in which the architect withdrew his original will from the notary, replaced it with another, and then took his own life. It seems he simply did not want to go on without his devoted advocate. A Montaigne-like friendship brought them close. The degree of closeness remains a subject for further scrutiny. The third, Castel Rodrigo, and this is part of the scrutiny, by the way, is an important personality in Borromini's life, but he's very elusive. They only overlap in Rome for 6 years, 1634 to 40. He's from an incredibly famous and old Portuguese family. It was his father, Christopher de Moura, the first Marquis of Castel Rodrigo, who was the engineer of the unified crown of Portugal and Spain, which lasted from the 80s, more or less, to the revolt of Portugal in 1640. But Iberia was one country, to the point when there was some thought that the capital should move from Madrid to Lisbon because it was much more central to the empire, and so on. But this is an amazing period, and this is guys and his family is right in the middle of that. The family, he comes from I'm sure he never went to this castle on the Portuguese-Spanish border, but the family's noble roots come from this castle. And there you see the harbor of Lisbon in an 18th century painting with his palace on the left, which is bigger than the royal palace on the right, and eventually will become the royal palace, both destroyed, of course, in the earthquake of 1755. This is a very important person. Had the revolt of Portugal in 1640 not thrown the political situation into turmoil, he would have paid for a noble, in fact, completely marble facade for San Carlino. He said, doesn't matter what it costs, spend everything in it. But then in 1640, he had to leave just when the facade might have been done. But he's gone from Rome for 7 years. He has a diplomatic career in Madrid, eventually returns to, in Vienna. He has to return to Madrid. He can't go to Portugal. Portugal has rebelled. He's a loyalist to Spain. He loses the palace, loses everything. Of his 8 children, 7 die, and so forth. He says, of this embassy to Rome, I lost all my fortune and 7 of my children. So it's a difficult time for him. Nonetheless, he remains a person of great prestige. However, and this is stuff that's just coming out, it's amazing, there's an element of affection between him and Borromini. The phrase that Borromini uses is, I'm more son than servant. It's the one letter we have, is that I'm more your son than your servant. It's in his household he learns the codes of Spanish dress, which he always dressed like. Everyone notices. He doesn't dress like a Roman or like a Frenchman, but like a Spaniard. There's this element of affection between a man who, in spite of an enduring marriage and a large family, could be accused in a secret tribunal before King Philip himself in Madrid of a crime that everybody knew he was guilty of, namely homosexuality. It leaves the door open and ajar to more hidden sides of the architect's personality, perhaps. There's the library he commissioned. There's Castle Rodrigo, and he paid for the San Carlino library. He's a bibliophile of the highest class. And of course, he loses his library with the revolt of Portugal. It's very important to remember Portugal and not just Spain. House, contents, and culture. Borromini lived his entire life in Rome at the same address on a small street called the Lane of the Lamb. You know, St. John has a lamb and so on, so the Lane of the Lamb. In the Florentine quarter. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not build a house as an architectural statement. The inventory drawn up after his death reveals a warren of rooms crammed full of interesting possessions. It's been known to scholarship for many years, and it's endlessly revealing. It doesn't tell us everything. The notaries were not that careful. It doesn't name the author of many of his 141 paintings, a large collection. Some were curious. They say he had a portrait of Cardinal Spada in a frame decorated with gilt seashells. I say, what in the world could that have looked like? There were many devotional paintings as though he were a pious person. There was a St. Francis, he's Francesco, okay. But then there were a lot of things like Triumph of Death, Death with Books, a Puto sleeping with death and time. And they may simply reflect a taste for a genre made popular by Salvatore Rosa, or they may reflect a deeper strain of melancholy. Curiosity. It is the conviction of my book that for all of their importance, the twin fonts that people always name for Borromini, Michelangelo and the Antique, and I explore both in chapters, are not enough to explain Borromini's exuberant creativity. The house provides a clue that literary sources don't, namely the collection that he built up, which included shells, which somehow seem appropriate for an architect who put a spiral on top of Sant'Ivo. This collection, which we call a curiosity collection, there's the house area, found this wonderful view in one of these Museo d'Italia, kind of new museums springing up in Italy, of the quarter that was annihilated in the 19th century and then again in the 1930s, just to the right of San Giovanni, right of the bridge, opposite the castle. So not there anymore, but that was where his house was. And then, of course, we have the maps of Rome that show it, and I've circled more or less the area where the Lane of the Lamb was. We don't know the address. But this kind of collection was not, one of the great collections of Rome, like Kircher, the most famous of them, or many of the smaller cabinets now people are discovering left and right. However, it does enrich the intellectual profile of the architect. The habit of collecting allowed Borromini common topics of conversation with patrons who collected lenses and mirrors or cultivated exotic gardens. Curiosity merits a long chapter because it allows us to listen to an otherwise silent mind on topics like the geometry of nature, the beauty of flowing light, or the alphabet of flowers, a wonderful phrase I take from the sermons of John Donne. The inheritance. A house is that's a cabinet of curiosities all in one. It's sort of wonderful. You see the seashells and this works turned on the lathe and prints and compasses and instruments and insects and all sorts of realms of knowledge are wrapped up here. And I have a lot on this kind of thing, which I think somehow reflects, not literally, but the kind of mentality of the architect, the inheritance. And we're getting there, by the way. Pazienza. A house is a fragile vessel for the archives of life, seldom seaworthy for more than a generation. His nephew stayed in the house for a while, but with each move and with each inheritance, first the curiosity collection vanished, then the antiques vanished, then the models vanished, and finally only the drawings were left. The nephew guarded them ferociously because he felt that he wanted to be an architect and he could base his career on saying, I have the great Borromini drawings. And you want to finish your Borromini church like the Lateran? I can do it for you because I have the drawings. Or he based his career on them, so he held them very tight. Borromini himself had wanted a publication of his work, a sort of opera omnia, but it never came about. Nonetheless, the collection after the nephew's death went on the market. It eventually came into the possession of a strange German nobleman called Philipp von Stosch, who is a mixture of many things: nobleman, Prussian, spy for the British, working for British agents but living in Rome, antiquarian, connoisseur of especially not only sculpture but ancient gems, collector of statues and things, especially collector of gems, by which I don't mean just jewels, but engraved, like the Hellenistic artist who will engrave a figure, that sort of thing. Fantastic collection of them, which attracted the interest of the great antiquary Winckelmann. Winckelmann wanted to meet Stosch, the old Stosch and the young Winckelmann, but Winckelmann got to Florence too late. Stosch had moved to Florence. In that palace, this fantastic Aminati Palace, where the Borromini drawings were preserved with all this other stuff. Anyway, Winckelmann stayed in the palace anyway, and he spent 6 months there cataloging the gems and published a book on Stosch's gems, which is extremely interesting. And then Winckelmann went away and everything was auctioned by the heirs, and the gems went to Berlin and the drawings went to Vienna, and that's why we have the Albertina drawings. So this is what happened to the Nachlass. But what happened to the reputation? And by the way, I should say that Stosch's letters and Winckelmann's letters when he's living in the house are quite interesting because he talks about the wonderful things he's finding. He says there's drawings by Michelangelo here, there's drawings by Raphael. And by the way, it's so interesting to read the collection of pornographic literature, and he names some titles. He had the best collection of pornographic literature in Florence, so one puts that into brackets. Anyone surveying late Baroque architecture in Italy, Iberia, or the Germanic lands will see the inescapable, namely that Borromini seems to be ubiquitous. Window frames with their curves, walls undulating in convex, concave patterns, cornices that curve and shape urban space, doors that embrace the visitor. Rare was the urban landscape of the period that did not include curved facades, or rarer still the Grand Abbey Church without twin towers like Piazza Navona. The masonry that Borromini pierced led to a progeny of skeletal wall system and vaults that open up to reveal hidden glows. Deemed dignified enough for the royal palace in Stockholm, in the highest class, nonetheless, we have the wonderful architect Filippo Juvara talking about the Borromini he loved, saying, yes, now Borromini's ornament is all the fashion with the people, which he gives as a capital P. So it's become the fashion of the middle classes, so to speak, in the early 18th century. However, if you're going to see traces of Borromini everywhere, it's hard to write a chapter on his real influence. And I've sort of, as a mental discipline, I said, I only want strong Borrominismo, not every curve, because every building in the 18th century is curved. Okay, but strong Borrominismo. At a certain point, the father of a movement dissolves into a vaguely discerned ancestor. So these strong works are places where an architect cast himself in a direct line of descent with the master through obvious citation, but then manipulates the borrowed forms in a creative, personal way. The spectator's response comes in phases: recognition, pleasure at the recall of an admired source, and then marvel at the transformation. That's a nice sequence that the cultivated spectator is expected to have. There were architects who professed admiration for Borromini, like Juvara, and I must say with our class, as some of you know, we spend a lot of time with Juvara in Turin, and I think it's a real revelation for everyone. Wonderful architect. We're in the 1720s now, in 1730s. And he saw the potential, for instance, of the raw brick in Borromini's. Even that, you can see the sequence here. Plan, raw brick church San Andrea delle Frate of Borromini, unfinished. Drawing by Juvara for Como Cathedral, rejected at Como, drawing accepted in Mantua, and you can see the sequence here. It's very nice in a way. And this is by a real admirer, so a professed admirer. There's another admirer, and this is one I've had the most fun with. But this is Juvara, by the way, a Campanile Juvara, where you see he's looking at Borromini, or the way he lets light in through the apertures here. Now, the young French draftsman of Dutch extraction called Gilles-Marie Openoord, let's mispronounce it, Openoord, studied in Rome in the 1690s, very intensely. He never stopped sketching. He would do very well at Notre Dame. He was nosy, and he pushed open every door. 6 thick sketchbooks survive with hundreds of pages of Baroque detail. The mise en page is special. There's no wasted space. True architect, he drew half a door or a window, and that was enough. He loved to climb, and he had X-ray vision, as you can see with the drawing of Sant'Ivo over there. He came back to Borromini again and again. It's his favorite. The sketchbooks are like a photo campaign, so to speak, of the buildings in the generation before just as they're finished, before inevitable change set in. For instance, this page, have fun with it. It shows on the lower left part of the facade of San Carlo, and on the right it shows the statue of St. Charles on the facade of San Carlo. But then, so puzzling, what's on top? Oh, let's turn the page a little bit. Don't waste that space. Remember, you have X-ray vision. You can see through everything. And let's look at it closer. Of course, it's a half drawing because that's what architects do. You can deduce the rest. Look at it closer. In fact, while we're at it, why don't you stare at it and let us put it into contact with an early 20th century photograph. And as you're looking really closely, I think you're probably noticing that there's a bridge going to the top of the church from the left, only preserved by Openoord, and a bridge going to the right, only preserved by Alinari. And these were destroyed, but they were originally built by Borromini so that you could get to the top of the cupola and climb the spiral. So this little piece of knowledge changes our perception completely of the way these buildings were used, the way education was symbolized by movement. So fantastic. You can see and these drawings, I just got the photographs from the Cooper Hewitt drawing. I've had black and white photographs for years, but to get the color drawings was just such fun. I also came across architects who disapproved of Borromini. Fischer van Eerlach, great show on Fischer just last couple of months in Vienna, was a student in Rome and loved Bernini, and he knew that Bernini was the way of the future when he went back to Vienna. He was going to be all Borromini. But I like to say, out of the corner of his eye, he explored the hidden reaches of Borromini. This door in the Casa dei Filippini on the left, no one ever goes to see it. It was not published in any of the books. That you've got to penetrate to the most difficult parts of the house to find it. And yet Fischer found it and used it 12 times very grandly in the Imperial Library at Vienna. So as I say, he looked at Borromini out of the corner of his eye, knowing he wasn't supposed to. So that's another kind of Borrominismo. The greatest student, of course, is Guarino Guarini, who arrived in Rome as a teenager, and there were 3 very important sojourns in Rome where he could see the buildings going up. So it's not through books or anything, it's going up. And so, for example, in the church of Saint-Anne-le-Royal, my student Susan Kleiber did wonderful work on this church, which doesn't exist anymore. It was not finished and then destroyed in the Revolutionary period. But you can see, I think, that he's borrowing for the bottom of the drum, the courtyard of San Carlo, and for the top of the dome, he's doing something like the Propaganda Fide. This is the young Guarini thinking Borromini's thoughts, but never mentioning, ever, Borromini. He conceals his tracks. If you got to do a city gate, what's better as a source? Well, maybe that window in the middle of the Propaganda Fide that he saw during his last visit. We can date it exactly to, I think, May of 1662 when he's there. So this is fun. Of course, he doesn't mention it. And then the unbelievable Sindone, where it's a synthesis of so many things French and Germanic and other things come in, but of course there's much of Borromini in there, and I thought I would just leave you with this interesting challenge to put all of this into the Sindone. I came across some wonderfully curious things as well. The Tower of the Christ Church, or the Savior Church in Copenhagen, which was added in 1749 by an architect called Lauritz de Thura to an older tower already built. The design was changed when the king said, "I want a singular design, not ordinary or common." This, of course, flung the door open to Borromini. All Copenhagen can be surveyed from this slender furl and neoclassical refinement of the speaking Baroque of Sant'Ivo. In Krakow, Poland, the architect Kaspar Bezanka, trained in Rome, built the Church of the Congregation of St. Vincent de Paul as a synthesis of Bernini and Borromini. On the outside, it channels Sant'Andrea al Quirinale. On the inside, the Propaganda Fide. The two rivals have seldom been more happily wed. Scholars wrestle over whether the great architect of Moravia and Bohemia, Santini, I won't go into it much, but his famous church of St. John Nepomuk, for instance, the people are trying to say, as a boy of 19, did he get to Rome? But there's no proof. Books are coming into Prague all the time, but did he actually get to Rome? And Czech scholars are divided, but I was reading, I don't read Czech, of course, but reading people interpreting a wonderful Czech scholar called Horima, Mojmír Horima, who sort of spent most of his life on this problem. And his conclusion is that it's not so much forms coming out of Sant'Ivo. The churches don't look that much alike, but the idea that you could synthesize geometry, relics, devotion, mysticism of some sort into a single design, plan and elevation, the sort of experience you could only get in Sant'Ivo in person. He says that's why the person, and he sums it up, he likes the idea that Santini really did go to Rome, and he says, it seems that knowledge of Borromini's architecture gave the young Santini the key to understanding himself. So it's a very nice way of talking about Borrominismo. Hawksmoor, again, I see the timing. Hawksmoor, of course, never traveled. He's one English architect who never got to the continent, but he had books galore. And at Oxford and All Souls College, he had wanted to design a buttery. Buttery is a room where the fellows buy their beer, a little room, and he designed it as a rectangle, as you probably should. But then Borromini's book on the Oratory of the Filippini came into his hands, and he saw that the dining room there was not only curved, but had curved benches and curved tables that followed the plan of the oval. And although it's very small, he did the same in this little room. And then he saw that other Borromini at San Carlo and other books had this amazing kind of coffered vaulting. And as I say, it's in this little room, which is off the beaten track, you never get in there really, this little coffered Zeppelin that we find the best trace of Borrominismo in England. Pevsner a long time ago said, well, in the side of St. Mary Woolnoth in London, we get something Borrominian. The key thing is the niche into which an architrave has been pressed, comes right out of the Propaganda Fide, and yes, yet he's right, but there one finds the fact that the Propaganda Fide is full of windows and light, and there's no windows at all, even the cellar there in this church. It's a monument to blindness. When a fellow Venetian, Clement XIII, became Pope, Piranesi, who wanted to be an architect, but never really could, finally thought he'd have the chance to do the choir of the Lateran. The Borromini nave is on the right, the counter-reformational transept is in the middle, and the new choir of Piranesi is on the left. There are 20 drawings in New York with 5 different projects in which he takes up all of the Borromini themes and does them better in a way. It's a fantastic thing, but of course there was no chance it would ever be built. Instead, what he did build, more or less at the same time, not for the Pope but for his nephew, was the Church of the Knights of Malta on the Aventine Hill, very much intact and in beautiful condition, where, although we think of Piranesi as the vedutista of the Roman ruin, the poet of the Etruscan sewer, the man of the megaliths, nonetheless, when he designs a church, he designs a Propaganda Fide. He designs a Borromini church, complete with all of this kind of heraldic ornament and ribs and And then the celebrant, and this was wonderful to be able to take this picture in the morning because it's only visible in the direct, low, horizontal morning sunlight. The celebrant over the altar, Borromini loved you to see through buildings, and here the celebrant sees through to a fantastic vision of the Holy Spirit. The cult of Palladio spreading in northern Italy and England after 1700 fed into an anti-Borromini current. Until the later 18th century, his reputation dipped to its lowest point. In fact, the image of Borromini in modern books was shaped by this polemic. I started with the one on the left, but the one that everybody sees in books is the one on the right. Now, what is this thing on the right? You have the architect's portrait, kind of taken from the painted portrait, not very well, but you have this incredible cloak, like a gentleman, flowing out of the frame, the architect's tools and compasses and everything on the left, the stone frame, the books, the learned architect. Now, where did this come from? This is 1720. I just saw it. You have a copy here in the rare book room. It's wonderful. 1716, this book came out from Palladio in England, of course, Leone's Palladio, and it's obvious where the Borromini portrait comes from. It's part of this ongoing polemic with Palladio. And the polemic with Palladio develops. The famous Milizia by the 1760s is saying things like this: little Vicenza, little Vicenza was just Palladio, but incomparably grander than Rome, with her Bramantes, obviously disdain, San Gallos, Buonarrotis, Peruzzi's, Vignolas, all of whom are not, even worse is Fontana, Maderno, Bernini, Borromini, and a swarm of others who, like Tartars, trampled the beautiful Greco-Roman architectural heritage. So this is, you're not going to really, come up from that. The recovery of, and this is the frontispiece of his book, where if you look to the left, he says, love this one, hoc emet, namely colonnades and a primitive hut. The other side, spurn this one, hoc spurnad, an oratory facade, disgusting. So this is the book that Jefferson studied for architecture. The recovery of Borromini started with renewed appreciation of Northern and Viennese especially, and Piedmontese Baroque, that was gradually extended to the sources of those styles. The early 20th century saw a new interest in the late phases of classical styles in general, late Roman art and architecture, late Renaissance and Baroque. Vienna, with the largest collection of Borromini drawings, became the center of new research. In post-Second World War Italy, Borromini was studied with enthusiasm by designers eager to shake off the constraints of early modernism and scholars venturing into the enchanted wood of iconography. The complementary embrace of scholar and architect is suggested in the work of Paolo Portoghesi, who died exactly 1 year ago, whose publications with their dramatic photographs range from 1955 to 2019. If, however, one goes to Portoghesi for the photographs, for readability, one goes to Anthony Blunt and his short book of 1979, this distinguished scholar of French classicism, of Poussin, of Naples, and of the Sicilian Baroque. When I was starting out as a grad student, I read his book in proof, the manuscript, before publication, and it's the thing one now reads. I hope after many years of research that I've gone deeper, but I wonder what my life might have been like if at that time I had grasped the full meaning of the warning in Blunt's preface: when Borromini bites you, he never lets go. So, thank you. Oh, you're all so patient. Amazing. Thank you. Maybe. Well, they've been patient enough. So, but sure, I'm willing if people want.
Excuse me. In the collection of you mentioned the Cabin of Curiosities. Was there any evidence of him owning or having studied specific treatises that predated him?
We don't have any titles of his 980 books, so we don't. We have an indication, though, that's very interesting. There was an architect, a scientist, or an engineer kind of scientist called Gaspari Berti, who Borromini knew, who was also a bibliophile, and as a kind of man who came up through the trades and became a Galilean scientist of some fame. He was the first person to explore the whole scientific question of the vacuum, impossibility of the vacuum, yet he could prove there was a vacuum under certain conditions. So a very important Galilean scientist, who was professor at Sant'Ivo briefly, but died young. And after he died, his very big book collection went somewhere. And we know that Borromini got some titles of it. And recently, a young Roman friend with whom I worked, a wonderful discovery, discovered the inventory of his book collection. It too is about 900 books. It's bigger than Galileo's library. And it has everything you can imagine of that kind of library, and it gives us an idea. And it's wonderful, inventories are wonderful because you have one notary up on a ladder, some kid, and his father down here writing in a big book, and the kid says, you know, Kleppery, Harmonici, Universalis. Well, this is Kepler's greatest book on universal harmony and so forth. So you get a very garbled kind of inventory. But we do have the titles for that one. We don't have them for Borromini. So we have to do a lot of possible, speculation.
Can you talk a little bit about Borromini and Bernini? Did they learn from each other? What did they learn from each other?
Bernini learned how to use the pencil, and that's amazing. And there's a wonderful portrait of Scipione Borghese in the Morgan, which everyone says, oh, it's red chalk and black chalk. Well, no, it's pencil, because he's working with Borromini, and he takes that very pedestrian, very sort of craftsman-like to him, so there's potential with the pencil. And Borromini, looking at Bernini's fancy, his grotesques, his Medusa's heads and so forth, says, well, I could do that too. And in his ornament for Palazzo Barberini, where they're working together, he does things that people say, oh, that's Bernini. No, it's Borromini being like. So there's a lot of cross-learning. I feel that people talk about who did the baldacchino. Well, I think it's obviously a sculptor's thing, and 10 years of incredible work, bronze casting and so forth. So it's Bernini's thing with all sorts of help. But Borromini was the architect working with him. And my feeling is if Borromini hadn't been there, we'd be seeing 4 columns on the floor today. He's the one that really said, to hold it together under all those conditions, it has to be like this, which is not the same as designing it. But that's a period when they're young, and then they break. And anyway, I like, as my students will know, I loved, as we're talking, as we're walking around the corner looking at both, I love to say, Bernini makes you happy, but Borromini makes you think. And, I don't think any of Bernini's happiness gets over into, not much gets over into Borromini, but not that much of Borromini's thoughtfulness gets into Bernini. That's a shallow comment, perhaps. Yes?
Thank you, Joe, for such a beautiful talk. I was listening, and my mind was wandering a little bit, thinking about the element of time and how it impacts. I mean, you talked about this book project, and sort of there were snippets of glimpses into your own relationship with the material, but in our audience, there are so many of our students who are just embarking on this course of study and the relationship with Rome. And as someone who spent a long time of your life dedicating your work to this architect and his work, could you talk a little bit perhaps about how the slow looking over time, over the course of a longer period, may have changed your thinking, and how that experience is unfolded in this book project?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, no, I've changed a lot. And on the other hand, I come across things I wrote a long time ago and say, that's pretty good. So one evolves. The editor will have to come and break through the door and take this book from me because I keep changing it. But such is the nature of all books. Big stages in the evolution. When I worked at first, I didn't really have a Dr. Fotter. I did technically, but was not interested in this period. But I found a very wonderful old man who was a nobleman from the Chigi family. His name was Incisa della Rocchetta. It's not Chigi, but it was a lateral branch. Very, very devout, a follower of a sort of lay oratorian, always dressed in like a 3-piece suit and extremely formal. You know, the Italians will say not tu, but lei. He never said lei, it was always alla. What does la sua presenza think of this? You know? So very formal and old-fashioned. But being a lay oratorian, he was very interested in the archives of Philip Neri. And when I went to the archives, not knowing quite what I wanted, having a vague idea, having a hunch, he kind of tested me all the time. He said, well, how can you prove it? How can you prove it? How can you prove it? And this being tested was very valuable for me. It was not part of my graduate education. How can you prove that? It's not part of anybody's graduate education in general. And so it was very good discipline, yeah. And eventually I could prove those things. I was looking at the documents and I could, but he made me do it. So that was an early stage, and I still love solving problems like that over drawings and documents. But these bigger issues of the, getting into the culture of curiosity, there's amazing and wonderful literature on all of that, by historians of science especially, and that let me see into this silent man like nothing else did. You only had to have a small curiosity collection in his house to know that he was interested in it, and therefore he's not a protagonist, but it's a clue into his mind. But then towards the end, I began to go back to good old-fashioned architectural history, and this is just in the past year or so, saying, hey, let's look at the Nachleben. And hey, it's so much fun. What about Fischer? Well, Fischer really disapproves, but look, he snuck in that visit. And Santini, it's sort of mystic. So Santini discovers himself, but it was fun to think through those. And the literature on all of them is extensive and good. German and Czech, these are hard things to get through. But you get people who write in Italian too, and so one can get at some of the sources that way. Yeah, I've changed a lot, and those are the big phases. Hi, I see up there Kupali.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed listening to one part that you just briefly alluded, and I would like to hear more about it. And that is related to the fact that when it came to Palladio and Borromini and how the transition over across the ocean coming to United States, you talked about the book Jefferson was referring to, and yes, this is great and this is not. Could you elaborate a little bit more, because that influenced the United States quite a bit?
Yeah, well, you might say Palladio goes to North America and Bernini goes to South America. Borromini goes to South America, just for sheer oversimplification. But I don't know if there are any Borrominian buildings in America. I don't know. But that whole business, Borromini uses Palladio all the time. He owns a Palladio for sure. He quotes from the best Palladio palace, in my opinion, is the Palazzo Valmarana in Vicenza. And I don't know if he ever got to Vicenza, but he has a woodcut of it. And he draws the woodcut and makes it the propaganda treaty. And he says, no, we want to change it. So he's quoting, and meant to be recognized as a quotation. So in his day, Palladio is the gospel, but it becomes a perception that Palladio is true antique spirit, and Borromini is the opposite. And all of Palladio's fantasy is forgotten, and all of Borromini's adherence to the antique models is forgotten. So, and they become diametrically opposed, thanks to these people like Malizio, who puts them in diametric consonant. This I didn't realize until I did that. There's another chapter on the decline, how just this use of Palladio to trash Borromini is a theme that grows and grows in the 18th century. Begins with the portraits, but it grows. Yeah, nice.
Hello, Professor. It's great to see you again.
Hi.
So this was discussed in the lecture and also brought up in one of the previous answers, but Borromini seemed to have a strong understanding of structure. He never designed a bell tower that fell over, for example. So I was curious, did Borromini ever study craftsmanship or
Well, he comes out
arts?
of what you do. Yes, you don't go to school. You come out of families that work in quarries and with stone. The whole world of the lakes is a world of stone. Everybody is a stone cutter, or the thing that's derivative of that is stuccoist, because it's made from marble. Everyone is in the world of stone cutting, but there's no work there, so they all have to leave. And most go to places like Warsaw or Vienna, Ireland even, But there is a train that goes to Milan, and then even a somewhat smaller train, but there, that goes to Rome. And there, some of the famous Romans are all from the lakes. And their training is in masonry, stone, structure, building. The wonderful Italian word for building is murare, to wall. And these Italian buildings are big walls, basically. And they do learn all of that. Bernini, is a humanist and a sculptor and an artist. And so he has no clue about structure, but he's a fast learner, of course. So, and he uses, Bernini is amazing at using everybody. Yeah? Oh.
Joe, I'm sure we all look forward to reading the book when it comes out. Thanks for a wonderful journey. When you were describing aspects of l'Oratorio dei Filippini, you mentioned that the curvature, various iterations of the curvature, the central portion of the facade was related to the depth of the space, the urban space. So I was wondering, I'm not going to ask you how can you prove it, but because that's a fact. No, I'm not going to ask how can you. Yeah, that's a fact. Yeah.
And the radius of that curve is that.
So I was wondering.
Then they really nothing happened. And you might have thought later about this facade should be a little bit dramatic, but in any case, the piazza gets smaller, and the final drawing is 150 palmi. So the deeper the radius, the more the drama. That's one of the rules. And again, these protruding cornices are also very interesting. They're very dramatic cornices, but because they protrude out, their radius will be smaller, and they'll be more dramatic still.
I was wondering, in this connection, is there any record or any evidence of how you arrived at this theatrical formulas? Has it anything to do with the way stage sets were designed? Or?
I don't know. Obviously, that world is the world of Juvara in the 18th century, the whole stage design where it's intimately related. But of course, this world, the thing that comes closest is not stage, but ephemera in the piazzas, the fireworks displays and all of that. And yes, there is probably, but they're all interested in these fireworks and these stucco and canvas and things. And there, one of my discoveries, I think significant, is in the fountain Piazza Navona, the Four Rivers Fountain of Bernini. What's its main source? And no one has ever pinned down the main source. Everyone has a lot of ideas. What's the main source? Rubens's book of festivities in Antwerp of a decade before, which is ephemera. And there are arches in Rubens's processions that are really the models for Bernini. So Bernini is very much in this world of ephemera, I think.
Thank you.
Okay.
How does the use of drawing, particularly soft drawing at the time, reflect the observation that architecture is made more precise by this medium? And how does it affect building and the relationship of the architect to construction?
Well, I'll answer another question, maybe it'll answer part of yours, but one of the phenomena of the Borromini, I showed a color drawing and then a pencil drawing, and that was a relatively simple pencil drawing, but if we could look at it a lot, we'd see layers, all sorts of interesting layers underneath, weren't too visible in the slide, because the pencil gives you exactness, but it also lets you keep on working. So there's two things, esattezza and nothing is ever quite finished. In the later part of his life, the nothing is ever quite finished dominates, because he keeps revising and revising and revising. But the esattezza is always there somewhere at the first layer or something. So how does this affect construction? Well, as we were talking before, it's the master masons who are the geniuses and who know how to build, even though it's famous that the contractors in Chicago in the 1890s would get a set of blueprints and they would say, one of those damn Wright buildings, and refuse them because they were hard to build. And I think the contractors for Borromini were probably tempted to say one of those damn Borromini. Yes, some do. And we have an interesting thing where the contractors come back and say, we were not paid enough because those vaults were of a straordinaria fattura that were rebuilt, and we had to buy 5 pounds of wax to make a model of that vault for the last rebuilding. So they're unhappy. They're not paid enough because of the constant pressure of the architect who says not good enough. We have several instances of that architect as tyrant, so to speak. Not that that ever happens here. So, quelle pazienza.
Very, very much.
Okay, thank you.